Alright, hey everybody, it's Miss McElroy. This is more of just going to be a generic review of the women's movements that we had covered prior to getting into women's work throughout history. So this is just going to be a really brief review of the women's movement, or the three waves of feminism. Okay, so just some women to know from the beginning. You have your founding feminist mothers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mary McClintock, Martha C. Wright, Lucretia Mott, and Jane Hunt. So these were the women that were trying to initially get the right to vote back in the 18th. They started with this document, which was basically a play on the Declaration of Independence. They named it the Declaration of Sentiments. If you had U.S. history with Miss Watkins or Mr. Armenti, you probably will remember some of this. Basically, it was to, review the injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women. Married women were legally dead in the eyes of the law because they weren't allowed to vote, they couldn't be on juries, they had no voice in the formation of the laws, they had no property rights, husbands had legal power over them, and their children, and their property, and their pay. Divorce and child custody laws favored the men, again giving women no rights. Again, women would have to pay property taxes, although they had no representation in levying these taxes because they couldn't elect anybody, no votes. Most jobs or occupations were closed to women, and when they did work, they were paid only a fraction of what men earned. This kind of came to be about and continues because men are still seen as the breadwinners or the earners for the family, and thus they get paid more. Women were not allowed to enter professions such as medicine or law. A lot of times they couldn't even get an education because colleges and universities would not accept women to even be students there. So that's why you see a lot of universities, just like your historically black colleges and universities, you had a lot of schools that started up as, women-only colleges like Chatham. With only a few exceptions, women were not allowed to participate in the affairs of the church. You could be nun, but you couldn't be a priest. We've seen some of that change nowadays where you do have women leading congregations, but again, initially, this time, they were not allowed. Robbed of their self-confidence, self-respect, made to be kind of, another responsibility and dependent on the men, whether that was their father or their husband. All right, so the first wave, enfranchisement, women's suffrage, the right to vote. This is the stuff that I had you guys write down. You have Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the National Women's Party. We watched the movie Iron-Jawed Angels that discussed and went through the passage of the 19th Amendment that was passed by Congress and then ratified in 1920. Thus, the 19th Amendment passed with the ratification in 1920. Stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. They did introduce, Alice Paul and Lucy introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, but it was never ratified to the Constitution still to this day. We're still short of the ratification vote. All right, a lot of videos here. You can click on them if you want. Basically, it's going through that time period post 1920. 1920, women get the right to vote. We go through the Roaring 20s, think Great Gatsby, then we hit the Great Depression. Then you go into World War II, Holocaust. Women were working in factories while men were away at war. If you've ever seen A League of Their Own, it deals with women coming in and, baseball, taking over that. Rosie the Riveter. So then, after World War II, what happens? We see the men return from war. They want their jobs back. Women get pushed out of the factories and the workplaces. The big thing there was have a baby, have family. This is where you get your baby boomers who are in their 60s and 70s today. We still have racial segregation and the Jim Crow laws that are still in effect. So imagine the intersection of both being a woman, but also African American or a woman of color, right? All right, second wave of feminism. This really focused in the 1960s. It kind of came about along and on the heels of the civil rights movement. Basically, women wanted to have control over their bodies and being able to have a planned family, not anything accidental. They wanted birth control access. They wanted more political representation. Oh goodness, what is it called? A group. Oh my gosh, I can't think of it right now. A special interest group, thank you. Okay, so the National Organization of Women was formed. JFK helped sign the Equal Pay Act of 1963, again, making it illegal to discriminate with pay based off of gender. The hard part here is, even though it's law, how do you enforce it? What are the gaps or the loopholes that allow people to still not pay women equally? Fighting for employment opportunities, basically, like if you're a woman, you shouldn't not be hired because you have the chance to be pregnant. This was a thing. You could be fired if you got pregnant. You had no security in employment for being a woman who could have a baby. Financial liberation in regards to credit, getting a credit card, not having to worry about getting it in your husband's name or with his approval. Basically having that financial freedom. And they were still trying to pass the ERA, but again, as I said before, it's still not ratified. Margaret Sanger, while not the coolest woman in the beginning, did start the birth control movement for women's right to control her body and reproduction rights. She founded the American Birth Control League. Now it's Planned Parenthood, which is obviously doing really good things for the community where it actually exists. The first legal birth control clinic in the U.S., women were able to get control of their own bodies, that body autonomy, my body, my choice concept. This movement also helped to educate women about existing birth control methods. 1936 Supreme Court decision declassified birth control information because it was considered obscene. Our bodies were considered obscene. In the 1940s and 60s, basically, again, you get more government representation. The Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor established to gather information about what's going on with women at work. They wanted to be an advocate for changes that women needed. President John F. Kennedy, again with the Civil Rights Movement, Eleanor Roosevelt, Committee on the Status of Women, Betty Friedan, and the National Organization of Women, again having that seat at the table, if you will, in the political arena. So, National Organization of Women, or NOW, what are they all about? Founded in 1966 by a group of people, including Betty Friedan and Reverend Pauli Murray, the first African-American woman Episcopal priest. Betty Friedan was the organization's first president. She wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique, basically recognizing the fact that as a housewife, that was what your life was supposed to be, but it's actually okay to realize that being a housewife shouldn't be, it doesn't have to be, your only goal as a woman, or even as a mother. You can want to do more, and you should be allowed to do more. It's your choice. This whole time we've been saying how feminism should be an idea about not limiting other women's choices, but empowering to make the choices that they want to make about their lives, their bodies, and their story. So their goals: work to eliminate discrimination and harassment in the workplace, schools, and justice system, secure abortion, birth control, and reproductive rights for all women, and end all forms of violence against women, eradicate racism, sexism, homophobia, and promote equality and justice in society. So those are some really big goals, right? So the Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires that men and women be given equal pay for equal work in that same establishment. Jobs need not be identical, but they must be substantially equal. It's the job content, not necessarily the title. So if somebody says that they have a higher title than you, but they're doing the exact same thing, but they're getting paid more, where is the determination about, are they actually doing more, or are you doing equal work? Don't let the title fool you. This is where you take a look at, what people's roles and responsibilities are, and the effort that's, required of you to fulfill your employment obligations. So equal work deserves equal pay. One of the things that I think we got into pretty well, especially when we had that giant packet of work about women's work throughout history, is that we see that throughout history, women have been kind of held to these domestic spheres, right, or these bubbles that they've been working in. The caretaking, the nurses, the teachers, right? They're not the doctor historically. They're not the principal historically. Again, we know that this has changed, but at what rate? They're the secretary, not the executive. And so a lot of times women are still seen in that sense as the caretaker, the giver, the one that should be subservient to men. You also make less money than men doing those same jobs. Some examples again: secretaries, teachers, telephone operators versus repairmen, and nurses. Now, again, in private sector, this is where you have that leeway of, who's actually making less and who's making more. In public sector jobs nowadays, it's a little bit more difficult because they know that there's more transparency in regards to pay. So I've said before about being in the Army. Yes, another sergeant like me will be getting the same pay as me, but when it comes time for promotion, depending on who's on the promotion board, they might look at me different, and it's those biases that still hold women back. All right, so again, women's financial liberation. What could you do? Well, do you realize that 25 years ago, married women were not issued credit cards in their own name? They were in their husband's. That most women could not get a bank loan without a male cosigner, and that working women full-time earned 59 cents to every dollar that a man earned. Now I think it's up to like 77 cents, maybe 78 cents. And that newspaper ads were, segregated. Men only, women need not apply. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination on the basis of color, race, national origin, religion, or sex. Covering all of those areas of intersection that a person could be made up of for their identity. Now it has to go a step further, which it hasn't done on the federal level at least, based off of a person's sexuality, right? Or gender identity. You can still be discriminated against for those things, and you're not protected federally. This is, talking about what happens if there is bias by the federal government and contractors. Basically, the more that you assist in the government and a higher dollar amount, $10,000 in government business, you're at a higher chance of being prosecuted if you're found to be discriminating based off of sex. Financial liberation continued. Pay equity occupations dominated by female workers, again, paid less to comparable male-dominated jobs. Glass ceiling. So, restricted women from certain positions, promotions comparable with worth, employers required to set wages reflecting differences in worth. Job evaluation studies versus market forces. There was a study done, I can't remember the exact university, but they basically created two identical resumes, but one had a male name at the top and one a female name. Well, when these resumes were put forth to a university for hiring, they chose the male, and they also started him at either $1,000 or $2,000 higher starting pay. So again, these inherent biases that people have about the worth or the value of a woman's work versus a man, again, we still have this societal expectation that a man is worth more. So the third wave, 1990 to present, somewhere on the internet, I think somebody had said in class that, well, we're in the fourth wave now, but really we're still fighting for third wave issues, right? Still fighting for reproductive rights and access. Roe v. Wade, the fact that you have the right to an abortion if you want one, that you have the privacy between yourself and your doctor, or to go to Planned Parenthood in a clinic to make that choice for yourself. Again, it's not necessarily saying that you have to, or that you think people should, but it's about allowing people that their own privacy and their own autonomy to make those choices. Women's enrollment in the military academies and service in active combat. It's just a couple of years ago they finally allowed women to serve in active duty positions. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can't physically compete and serve. And they found that it had no bearing, and that the women who have tried out and have made it to these units or made it to these military occupations, they've done just fine. Women in leadership roles in religious worship, affirmative action, we're still fighting for equal pay, still fighting bias against the workplace, raises and promotions, still fighting against sexual harassment, and still no equal rights amendment. So what questions would you have for today's generation, or the next generation, the kids that were born in 2013, the kids that were born in, what do you think they're going to be fighting against? Do qualified women now face a level playing field? Maybe in some ways, but there might still be a lot of bias against women. The idea of sex work, right? Pornography, strippers, Prostitution, right? In Las Vegas, it's legal. Is it degrading? Is it dangerous to women, or is it simply a free speech issue, at least with porn? What if women are making these choices because that's what they want to do? Are we going to use the stick of feminism against them and saying they can't? Again, just because it's not your choice doesn't mean it might not be somebody else's. Is it dangerous? Maybe to some. Maybe in certain situations. If there's no legal requirement to demand testing, to demand safety, then yeah, it's probably going to be dangerous. Sexual harassment, whether that's in school, in the workplace, amongst friends, if it's making you uncomfortable and it's sexual in nature, that's sexual harassment and you have to speak up. So where does flirting leave and harassment begin? And nowadays we have the Me Too movement, the whole backlash against the movie industry and so many occupations and so many areas of employment. This idea of sexual assault, oh, it's just joking, oh, it's just locker room talk. But it's not. It's inappropriate. And then when we talk about rape and, victim blaming, was her skirt too short? What was she wearing? She shouldn't have been drunk. So these are some things that we're fighting against today, and that you'll hear judges say, well, you shouldn't have been wearing that, or professors at universities and them saying, well, don't go out drinking alone. Well, who's really to blame for the rape? Is it alcohol? Is it your short skirt? Or is it the predator that raped you? So these are just some things to kind of think about today's generation. All right, I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to hit next slide because that's going to stop the recording. But again, just be aware that the next document that you're going to see in the assignment category in Microsoft Teams, and I will post it in Google Classroom as well, that's going to be the case summary for Lori Pearson against the mining. And you're going to, if you haven't already read it, read through the case summary and then answer the summary questions. From there, if you want to watch the movie, watch North Country, take some notes on the back of the paper, or just take some notes somewhere. And the next time we have a meeting, if you've watched it, we can talk a little bit about it and what you thought and your reflections. Again, just be aware it is a trigger warning. It is a rated R movie, so if you're not 17, don't watch it without your parents' permission. From there, we'll start to get into our next topics that deal with domestic violence and gendered violence, and we'll look at some statistics. Alright, that's it for now. Just a quick little video, quick little recap, and I will talk to you guys next time. See you later.